With global movements such as Black Lives Matter or Rhodes Must Fall sweeping the world like a whirlwind, bringing down or at least shaking in their wake statues, celebrations and respected institutions, it is becoming increasingly evident that engagement with the colonial past has become a necessity. The times are clearly over when avoidance of this past, glorious for some, shameful for others, was an option. Little attention has been paid so far to the long-term impact of the ways in which empires ended. Did a negotiated end of empire, for instance, make a difference? And to whom? We have known for a long time that the way in which a new post-colonial state emerged had the potential to influence its future trajectory. Independence rolled from the hands of a reticent decolonizer among blood and tears did not make for an auspicious start towards democracy and freedom. But what about the centers from where colonial power had radiated, often for centuries? Did the modalities of decolonization make a difference as to how the former colonial power negotiated questions such as bilateral relations, migration, memory, or simply cultural flexes? Decolonization was never something that happened out there, but rather impacted colonial centers in myriad ways. Like any linking process, decolonization affected both ends of the link, whilst the emphasis has long been placed primarily on the colonized end of it, and for good reason, given that they were on the receiving end of colonialism, the colonizing centers, or the metropoles, if you wish, have often been neglected. Through several volumes, my research has sought to address this imbalance and to highlight the centrality of the imperial experience, as well as its associated corollary, decolonization, to the lives, imagination, and aspirations of countries which used to possess an empire on which the sun never set, but which was no more. So I'm inviting you today to a very short journey through the research which I have undertaken in relation to the end of empire in Britain and Europe, and also the ways in which I hope that my work contributes to rethinking what decolonization meant in the metropoles all around Europe. But perhaps before we go any further, let us just rewind a bit and think about where colonialism started, how empire colonized the world in some way. First of all, it's very important to highlight the centrality of the imperial experience ever since Christopher Columbus discovered in 1492 the Caribbean, the island which would become known as Hispaniola. And obviously this was a discovery for the Europeans, but not for those who were living there. So this is very relative, and in itself is a statement which testifies the extent to which some of the very long established habits of a Eurocentric analysis of the world still remain completely in place. That was the start of a trajectory that lasted several centuries and which saw a succession of powers at the helm of global empires, starting on the Iberian Peninsula of Portugal and Spain, but then moving all around Western Europe, including the Netherlands, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, the latter two in the 19th century. And this led to a situation whereby the colonial order prevailed globally, and it was actually the conduit through which modernity emerged at the time. It established some commercial circuits that still exist today. It was also the channel and the incentive for technical progress all around the world, because colonizing powers realized that without the means to reach new places, without the means to transport their settlers, without the ability also to support these settlers through flourishing trade, they would not be in a position to withstand the attacks from their competitors. So all this contributed to making empire a fundamental source of political beliefs and practices in the world. And we could even go further and argue that the slow emergence of the notion of international society owes a lot to the circuits of circulation that emerged within imperial context. And last but not least, as is shown, for instance, by the very widely spread use of the English language or other languages like French, Spanish, or Portuguese, linguistic areas around the world are a direct consequence of the imperial experience. And that lasted for many centuries. So it's only natural that we should think that empires colonized the world, but they also colonized, very famously, minds. Because minds were actually obviously they were permeable to the ideologies which were spread through imperial means. There was, I argue, and it's something which I studied in my first monograph, an imperial way of seeing the world, of perceiving alterity, of perceiving remote places. My first book, which examined the ways in which imperial heroes who acted in Africa between 1870s and the First World War were represented, packaged, and promoted in Britain and in France, and how actually these very far-reaching legends, national heroic legends, had a durable impact on the ways in which the African continent was perceived in Britain and in France up to the present day. So there is this imperial way of seeing the world, of which there are still very significant consequences. At the time when empire was active, was all alive, there was what I call the double helix of cultural imperialism. In the colonies, there was what has been known very widely as the cultural imperialism, the imposition of the values, beliefs, and languages of European colonizers at the expense of indigenous practices and customs. But this was a code, and it was neglected until the 1980s in the historiography by a similar process of colonization of the metropolitan minds. We refer to the metropolitan centers so as being London or Paris or Berlin in the case of the German Empire, or Madrid in the case of the Spanish Empire. And it's all about actually where the cultural and political impetus for empire came from. Well, these places and the populations which had settled in the metropoles were actually extremely influenced as well by the imperial mindset, in particular from the late 19th century onwards, as a result of the increased importance of the mass media. And that gave rise to what John Mackenzie has called popular imperialism. And my volume is actually a contribution to this historiographical movement, which tried to look at the ways in which empire changed the ways in which people thought in the metropoles. Empires, as I mentioned, colonized minds. They did it in a variety of means, actually, some of which were explicit, such as, for instance, the ways in which people speak or the languages they use, and others were implicit, such as, for instance, how the languages that they speak influence their ways of seeing the world. So all this has led me to develop the deep belief as a historian, but also as a citizen, that empire is actually a wonderful way of understanding the present. The colonial past offers us a unique prism into the post-colonial present. And this is what I have explored in detail in partnership with the University of Oxford International Relations specialist Calypso Nicolaidis in a volume that we co-edited entitled Echoes of Empire, in which we try to bring together the three concepts of memory, identity, and colonial legacies. And what we endeavored to achieve in this book was to ensure that imperialism was not considered as a phenomenon of the past, but rather as one with very tangible ramifications in the present. And that, we argue, is needed in order to assess the global role of empire in shaping international society. In particular, being able to track down the remnants of ethnocentrism in contemporary projects, something which Calypso calls e-universalism, which, in her words, is the tension between the two faces of European universalism turned EU universalism, namely, on the one hand, exceptionalism to the point of justifying domination, and on the other hand, solidarism as transnational responsibility. And that very much plays into the wider realization, which was formulated by John Mackenzie in his own contribution to Echoes of Empire, that history seems so often to be about present politics. So it's all well and good to tell you that empire was so important in terms of shaping the global society as we know it today. But what about the moment when it came to an end? What about decolonization and the overthrow of empire? It is, I argue, a pivotal moment for colonized populations who found ways of reclaiming their agency. We know that this was the moment when significant proportions of colonized populations were able actually to overthrow centuries of oppression. It was also the moment when a new dawn came for many countries which had to cope with the colonial yoke and which then had become freed to think a future on their own. Together with the Second World War, it was possibly the most defining turning point for all European and also non-European countries in the post-war period. So along in the 20th century, it was possibly one of the two most defining moments. The ones that saw the number of countries who benefit from membership of the United Nations expand dramatically as huge chunks of the British, French, or other empires reached their political independence. But, and this is where I think quite a lot has been missed in terms of decolonization, many people thought that by the time you get new representatives settling in New York at the UN headquarters, representing their country with a new label in the UN General Assembly, that meant that political emancipation had been achieved. Perhaps on the surface it was true, or it was even true in a deeper sense in a few cases. But in general, we can defend the view that actually the transfer of power was the start of the process rather than the end. So throughout this half century, from the independence of India in 1947 up to the moment when the British flag was finally lowered in Hong Kong in 1997, we see a number of countries that reached political independence. But was that to say that in fact they had reached cultural independence as well? Not really. And that's the reason why I have also studied in one of the volumes which I co-edited with colleagues from the universities of Manchester and Lancaster as well, the concept of cultural decolonization, which looks at the persisting influence of the colonial past in everyday life in particular, through museums, statues, street names, scholarships, even institutions, all the general imaginary which prevailed on both sides of the divide. So we're talking about a pervasive influence which was not eliminated overnight by political independence. There was a lack of realization, in my view, about the fact that this was a two-way process, and this lack of understanding of the complex phenomena at work explains also the many unresolved issues that still undermine political debate in both ex-colonies and ex-metropoles. Too many discussions have been swept under the carpet and therefore preventing people from engaging with the question of cultural decolonization, asking in particular the key question of what to do with the remnants of empire. Is it about rejecting it? Is it about recycling them? Is it about reviving them? Looking at a global appraisal, we see that rejection tends to be the overwhelming response which has been decided, but it's not the only one. There were cases of recycling. In particular, in the volume which I mentioned earlier, we explore a few cases in decolonizing imperial heroes, but also revival as well, for instance, such as the Savognin de Brazza Memorial in Brazzaville in the Republic of the Congo. Looking at these various strategies and these various reactions to the cultural legacy of empire, we see the extent to which the influence of empire was pervasive and went beyond decolonization, and how it also worked both ways. The same way as we say that it takes two to tango, it takes also two to decolonize. It's important for populations on both sides to have a genuine and open engagement with this shared past and see what they can and want to do with it. And it's the reason why some problems have been persisting in bilateral relations or in political debate is that these dilemmas have often remained unresolved until now. So what I'm seeking to achieve through my work as a researcher, in colonial and post-colonial studies, is to go beyond Manichaean approaches and actually try to ascertain the multiple ways in which, in particular for the purpose of today's presentation, decolonization was a phenomenon that affected the entire European continent and which was also a process that started perhaps in the immediate post-war period. I mean, in the British case, it started in 1947. One could argue that in the French case, the echoes of decolonization reached the center of the French metropole as early as 1946 with the start of the Indochina War. And to a large extent, this is still work in progress. So what does decolonizing Europe, and there is a question mark in the latest volume, which I co-edited with my US-based colleague Matt Stannard, who is a professor in history at Berry College. And we argue that, first of all, the decolonization cannot be evoked in the past. This is the reason why we're putting the interrogation mark. The question mark is actually a way of underlining the fact that this is still ongoing and that some questions obviously cannot be answered. Has Europe been decolonized? Well, we cannot tell because it's still going on. And also, well, has it been decolonized completely? That's also another question. Because what decolonizing Europe does is that it highlights the ways in which we're dealing with two different complementary temporalities. On the one hand, the short-term one, which is the political decolonization, which I mentioned earlier, the lowering of the flag of the old colonial power and its replacement with that of the independent country. But there are also longer-term ones, the cultural decolonization ones. And this is actually a very messy process, if you want. It's a very entangled process, involving, on the one hand, former colonies, but also former colonial powers. And if that was not enough, the conversation is often jammed by further memory groups, for instance, some, and as well as political parties, sometimes trying to benefit from political dividends by trying to use for political benefit some long-term historical questions relating to empire and decolonization. And obviously, the longer-term cultural processes, the processes that we define with Matt Stannard in the volume as the ebbs and flows of decolonization, the fluxes and refluxes of decolonization, in an attempt to show the fluidity, the movement and dynamism, and how they are actually key characteristics of the decolonization process, including in the metropoles. Because for a long time, all the emphasis was placed on decolonization and the negotiations surrounding decolonization in the ex-colonies. But we want actually to look at the flip side of that argument. We want to change the perspective through decolonizing Europe and to bring forward the argument that, in fact, decolonization also started in the metropoles as well and generated some very long-standing changes in the ways in which European countries projected themselves, interacted with the rest of the world, and also dealt with their economic and political projections. So to what extent is decolonizing Europe an unfinished business? This is a question that very much lies at the heart of the volume. And what we did with Matt Stannard was to take the story of popular imperialism to the next chronological step. Both of us had had the good fortune of contributing to John Mackenzie's earlier edited volume, European Empires and the People, which very much examined the ways in which empire changed metropolitan cultures in around half a dozen countries. So there was already this pan-European approach. But it all stopped at the time of decolonization. We started in the 19th century and finished roughly in the 1960s. And what we sought to do in decolonizing Europe is to take the story over from the moments when countries like Britain or France had to rethink their role in the world by reorientating their world vision back to the metropole as opposed to as an empire on which the sun never set. And that naturally meant that we had to take into account a variety of approaches. In particular, the meaning of decolonization. What did it mean to put an end to an empire which had existed for several centuries in many cases? How was this mediated as well to the populations in the metropole? How was it represented? The insurrections, for instance, that marked some of the processes of transition of power, but also sometimes how was the end of empire out there presented at home? How was it reported? What was the impact on the material culture of the end of empire? And last but not least, how did decolonization play with two of the very fundamental questions which have agitated a lot of European countries in the last decades when it came to colonialism, namely migration and memory? And we argue that this is primarily still work in progress. And some of the questions that are at the heart of our analysis is very much to what extent has it fully happened? What still remains to be done in order to talk about a genuine decolonization, especially when it comes to the cultural realm? And also, when did it take place? How did it take place? Where did it take place? And what remains to be done? Let me look in more detail at a few aspects which are at the heart of this reappraisal of what decolonization meant, not for the populations who were able to claim their independence from the colonial yoke, but actually those who were back in the metropole and had also to rethink their role in the world, to rethink as well what their country stood for. We're looking at decolonization as a mediated experience, in particular looking, for instance, at the press coverage of insurgencies and to a lesser extent the counterinsurgency operations. And that encompasses a very wide variety of situations. Thinking about India, about Britain, for instance, that means thinking about how Indian emancipation was covered, about also how the petition of the British Raj was reported, but also what were the reasons behind the Malayan insurgencies cover-up, for instance, in the press, and the fact that for a long time it remained hidden in plain sight to some extent. Or even more also topical, given the developments that we've seen in the last few years as well, the ways in which the Mau Mau rebellion and its repression at the time of Kenyan attempt to reach independence were particularly significant. In France, the Indochina and Algerian wars also offered plenty of opportunities for the media to engage with the rather dirty business of decolonization, including the use of torture and as well as quite of rather unpleasant military situations for which the local populations had to pay a heavy toll. But it's not limited to these two samples. For instance, we could think about the Netherlands and the independence of Indonesia, or later on even the coverage in the Netherlands of the New Guinean insurgency, which is a case study which appears in Decolonizing Europe. Or also another example, for instance, from the volume, another couple of examples from the volume, the coverage of the Mogadishu massacre in Somalia in the late 1940s, or of course as well the coverage, the press coverage of the emancipation of the African colonies of Spain in the Spanish Peninsula. So all this mediated experience, this wide coverage in the press, paved the ground for a long-lasting influence in political consciousness and debates, which brings us straight to the question of history, memory, and politics after empire. A very complex cocktail which saw actually actors coming from a variety of perspectives, especially because of competing memory groups vying for influence. On the one hand, the repatriated settlers who wanted to defend the overall legacies and the perception of their role within the colonial environment, but also the repatriated collaborating groups like the Harkis, for instance, in France, who believed that they had been left out and that they had been spoiled by also the French government's refusal to acknowledge its responsibility and to protect them and to find them new lives in metropolitan France. And also, crucially, the second generation migrants, some of whom came from families who had very strongly supported the independence movement. So the circumstances, all the necessary circumstances were united to create a cocktail between competing and sometimes frontally opposing groups. Political parties also were quick to realize that they could seize on topics closely linked to empire and decolonization to bring to the fore, as part of their discussions, questions about the influence of migration, for instance, on the ethnic makeup of the metropoles, the question of the potential nuisance inherited from international intervention and sometimes having a very domestically orientated agenda as opposed to a universalist one which had characterized the pre-decolonization period. And obviously, ranging from Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, very infamous speech, down to Eric Zemmour in France at the time of the 2022 presidential election, we see the question of immigration and national identity being used and for political profit and being manipulated as well in order to try and win votes. So it seems to be perfectly fair to say that the memory of colonialism is an endless source of controversies, in particular around the effects and legacy of colonialism, with vocal statements made by the ex-colonized and their offspring about the reality of the oppression that was experienced under the colonial system. But on the other hand, the ex-settler groups trying to defend the vision also of the process and what they did in the former colonial environments, and states on both sides of the divide, so former colonial states, former colonized states as well, navigating between domestic political pressures on the one hand and demands from their populations on the other. So there is a very complex and unstable mix between the demands of conflicting demands between each side of the colonizer-colonized relationship. And there is even disagreement over the position to adopt with this past that does not pass, if we use also an expression borrowed from the vocabulary attached to the Second World War. Is it better to think about oblivion or atonement or debate? And so these are actually generating endless debates in political contexts with different levels also of acuteness depending upon the country. So in some countries like France, it's been much more vocal. Other countries like Britain, it's been more muted. But the common denominator is that it has become a question that cannot be avoided. And this is something that happens at a time when the cultural exchange between the colonial center and the colonized periphery has never been actually more equal. There is now an exchange. It's a much more equal exchange which is taking place. When we look, for instance, at the situation of tastes, creation, and practices, we see that there is an ever stronger influence of colonial heritage in artistic, cultural, religious, and even culinary traditions of the former metropoles. I mean, I'm speaking from Birmingham, where obviously Indian cuisine enjoys a very well-established reputation. And some Indian dishes reputedly started actually in Birmingham before being re-exported to India. Likewise, in France, Vietnamese or North African cuisine have become very common staples. And I could multiply examples. In the Netherlands, for instance, Indonesian cuisine is very widely spread. Argentine and Latin American cuisine is also very strongly represented in Spain, and so on and so forth. So there is at the moment a cultural boomerang effect with the former metropoles now welcoming and integrating into their mainstream some very deep and significant cultural influences coming from their ex-colonies. And that sometimes leads them to play also a leading role in offering global echo to cultural production from the ex-colonies. And that ranges from the very private environment. There is in Decolonizing Europe, for instance, a chapter that examines the ways in which mementos and decoration from the empire were brought back by former colonial officials in Britain in order to recreate a sort of imperial space within the confine of an individual home. And this observation could also be multiplied across the board and within different European contexts. There are also long-lasting alterations in taste in the ex-metropoles. For instance, I've contributed a chapter to the volume which looks at the ways in which the Sahara Desert has become such an important beacon in the French imagination, encapsulated, for instance, by the Dakar Rally, not least, but also with other examples, as a result of the French conquest of the Sahara in the late 19th century. So all this has redistributed the roles between colonizer and colonized in ways which are very subtle and which are also ever-changing, not least because the former colonial centers have sometimes actually become centers as well of cultural and artistic exchange. And this is, for instance, Matt Stannard's contribution in Decolonizing Europe about the role of Brussels and Paris as hubs through which Congolese art is being negotiated and distributed around the world in the 21st century, obviously giving rise as well to accusations of neocolonialism. Any discussion about the consequences of decolonization on the metropolitan centers has to deal with the question of identity. It has become, indeed, a recurring topic when it comes to the question of national identity. And it is still at the heart of many political manifestos which think that they can actually get electoral benefits from including it at the heart of their political offer. And to a large extent, it's easy to understand, because if we adhere to Michel Foucault's definition that politics are actually defining the right to live, as well as that those who actually have to die, the reflection around identity is a way of reflecting about who has the right to live in the ex-metropoles, in sharp contrast with an earlier situation where transfers of population were much more fluid between the metropolitan center and the colonial periphery. It was not always the case, it was sometimes restricted, but especially in the post-war period, with the improvements in means of communication, there was actually a much more seamless connection between the metropolitan center and the colonial periphery. And that has led directly to what has been known as the Windrush generation, people who came into the UK from the Caribbean because it was possible to do it at the time. They didn't need to be documented. And then when the Home Office implemented its hostile environment, these were people who were empty-handed to demonstrate their right to live in the UK, sometimes after having spent their entire lives in the country. So that very much begs the question of who carries the legacy of empire. Is it governments But that creates sometimes some internal tensions, and I would like just to use as an example the fact that the city of Brussels decided to honor the key African leader Patrice Lumumba by naming a square after him. But the only problem is that actually Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in his home country of the Congo with the help of Belgian secret services. So we can see here some of the tensions inherent to trying to develop a very inclusive national identity, which at the same time might be in direct conflict with some historical decisions made by the country. And also, does the legacy of empire have to be carried by repatriated soldiers or settlers and their representative groups, or second-generation migrants? So it's very much implicitly or explicitly at the heart of many discussions. And obviously, when it comes to decolonization and politics, we should not forget that politics is also about deciding what the country stands for on the international scene in the concert of nations. What does the metropole represent? And that is a problem which was summarized in the post-war period by Dean Acheson when he said that Britain has lost an empire but has yet to find a role. And this very much applies to all European countries in the 21st century, still in the 21st century. On the one hand, they're very much still committed to the covert promotion of the colonial mindset as a force for good, in particular, for instance, through linguistic diplomacy or political diplomacy as represented by the Commonwealth or the Francophonie or the Comunidade dos Países de Língua Portuguesa, the CPLP. But on the other hand, there is also a wish to use these fora as ways of demonstrating that these countries have moved into new territories, into a new era, and that the colonial past is over, and that now it is actually a family that meets as opposed to a very hierarchical organization. In some cases, there is also a reinvestment of the will to radiate power in a collective attempt, for instance, to regain global influence. This is particularly evident in the EU project, in the case of many European countries, and in particular France, but also to a lesser extent Spain or Italy. And also in the opposite direction, but equally relevant, in the reactivation of all dreams out of the European Union, in the case of Brexit, for instance. Brexit has been tapping into all discussions about Britain's allegiance to the Commonwealth as opposed to the European Union. So there is here also a very rich discussion about whether actually the EU can be a vessel for renewed imperial ambitions or whether it is actually being out of the EU which allows Britain to reach the stage of what some have termed the Empire 2.0 stage. And we've got every reason to believe that, yes, it does make sense to reflect very deeply and profoundly about the global footprint of colonialism because it has become lately, as of late, a political tool. If we look, for instance, at recent political decisions made among old colonized countries, we see that there is at the moment an attempt to criminalize colonialism in Algeria. It's not likely to be voted for the time being, but the very fact that it is being discussed in the Algerian parliament shows the ways in which the political consequences of colonialism are far from over. China, for instance, also uses regularly the idea of the colonial heritage as a way of undermining the claims to universalism made by the international community, led in particular by the West. So, for instance, there was an anonymous op-ed in China Daily in June 2021, which criticized the last holdouts of colonialism, which still linger on, although the majority of colonies have been liberated from the grip of their colonial masters over the past more than 7 decades after World War II. And then they made a reference to the Malvinas. So the Falklands Islands are a case in point, with the United Kingdom still clinging to its colonial mentality and refusing to return the islands to Argentina. And then carrying on to refer to their hanging on to the colonial mentality, which has become, I'm quoting, a stumbling block to the settlement of common problems, such as global warming and poverty alleviation for the healthy development of the international community. But if I may mention, actually the compliment was completely returned back by the UK as well, with, for instance, Tory MP Damian Green talking about the Chinese using money, influence and pulling countries into debts to effectively become a new colonial power around the world. And that was that was a statement made on the 1st of December 2021. So there was these accusations of neocolonialism can be used also as a very convenient weapon in international relations in both senses. So the Chinese, for instance, make regular references to European colonialism in Africa, but very often Europeans are now accusing China of neocolonial attitudes on the continent, in particular because of its greed for primary resources. So this very much shows the relevance which the history of empire has retained in the present day, and how also fluid it can be, because it can be used actually from many directions, and it is still a highly contentious topic, both in the metropoles but also globally. And so this very much leads us towards the concluding section of this talk, which I hope will have also inspired you to engage more closely with the work which I mentioned, and in particular the books which I wrote or co-edited, and in particular looking at this question of decolonization and what decolonization means in the 21st century. You will have understood from the presentation that I argue that it is still very much work in progress, not only for the formerly colonized countries, but also for the former colonial metropoles. And the reason is that the phenomenon has been genuinely global. It's affected obviously the entire world, but if we look also at the context within Europe, it's affected all Western European countries, from Aberdeen to Algeciras and from Berlin to Bristol, most notably obviously with the Edward Colston statue quite recently. Due to the multiple and dense links also inherited from the colonial experience, decolonization has affected many areas involving human interaction, from language to trade, from soap operas to voting choices, from culinary practices to literary pursuits. And so to a large extent, decolonization represents the most profound shift that some of these countries have had to face in terms of politics, cultures, and self-projection. So the journey is far from over.